Over there and over here 녹음 2일차 청크컷 시작하겠습니다.
A multi-ethnic society makes foreign policy more complicated.
A multi-ethnic society makes foreign policy more complicated.
Here are a few vignettes from Britain over the past week.
Here are a few vignettes from Britain over the past few weeks.
Tens of thousands of protesters marched on the Israeli embassy.
Tens of thousands of protesters marched on the Israeli embassy.
Some shouting Israel is a terror state.
Some shouting Israel is a terror state.
A convoy of vehicles festooned with Palestinian flags.
A convoy of vehicles festooned with Palestinian flags
drove into a heavily Jewish part of North London.
Drove into the heavily Jewish part of the North London.
While a thug bellowed, "Fuck the Jews," and rape their daughters.
While a thug bellowed, "F the Jews" and rape their daughters.
Two Leicester City football players celebrated their victory in the FA Cup.
Two Leicester City football players celebrated the victory in the FA Cup
by unveiling a Palestinian flag. Many of these protesters belong to Britain's large Muslim population.
Many of these protesters belonged to Britain's large Muslim populations.
The fact that Britain is now a multi-ethnic society means
The fact that Britain is now a multi-ethnic society
events abroad resonate more loudly than they used to.
Means that events abroad resonate more loudly than they used to.
The invasion of Iraq under a Labour government.
The invasion of Iraq under a Labour government
infuriated many British Muslims. The fate of Kashmir is such a hot issue in Wickham in rural Buckinghamshire.
The fate of Kashmir is such an issue in Wickham, in rural Buckinghamshire.
The local Tory MP has started the Conservative Friends of Kashmir.
Since the local Tory MP has started the Conservative Friends of Kashmir.
Classical statesmen did their best to protect foreign policy from democratic pressures.
Classical statesmen did their best to protect foreign policy from democratic pressures.
In order to keep their eye, like Plato's guardians, on the state's long-term interests.
In order to keep their eye on, like Plato's guardians, on the state's long-term interests.
Today, foreign policy is buffeted not just by democratic pressures.
Today, foreign policy is buffeted not just by democratic pressures,
but by ethnic forces. Political parties compete to win the votes of ethnic minorities.
Political parties compete to win the votes of ethnic minorities.
With foreign policy thrown into the bidding wars.
The
Conservative Party is mounting a challenge. To Labour's traditional hold over minorities. Particularly in non-Muslim populations from the Indian subcontinent. Particularly in non-Muslim populations from the Indian subcontinent.
Particularly in the non-Muslim populations from the Indian subcontinent.
Indian origin voters favoured Labour over the Conservatives.
Indian origin voters favoured the Labour over Conservatives.
By only about 5 to 4 in the 2019 general election.
By only about 5 to 4 in the 2019 general election.
Compared with 3 to 1 among ethnic minorities as a whole.
Compared with the 3 to 1 in ethnic minorities as a whole.
The government, therefore, has an interest in forging close relations with India.
The government, therefore, has a strong interest in forging close relations with India.
Even if that strains relations with Pakistan.
It also means that
party activists have an incentive
It also means that party activists has incentives
to tell Indian origin voters sotto voce
to tell Indian origin voters, sotto voce,
that the Labour Party is a plaything of Muslims in general
that the Labour Party is a plaything of Muslims in general,
and Pakistan in particular.
and Pakistan in particular.
Ethnic pressure groups are multiplying.
Ethnic pressure groups are multiplying.
There are now 40 to 50 Friends groups on the Tory side of the aisle
There are now 40 to 50 Friends sides of the Tory aisle,
and about the same number on the Labour side.
and about the same number on the Labour side.
The Conservative Friends of Israel has helped to turn the Tories
The Conservative Friends of Israel has helped to turn the Tories
from an instinctively pro-Arab party
from an instinctively pro-Arab party
into a broadly pro-Israeli one.
into a broadly Israeli one.
Now, a second CFI, the Conservative Friends of India, is on the rise.
Now a second CFI, the Conservative Friends of India, is on the rise.
It points to the growing number of Hindu faces
It points to the growing number of Hindu faces
in the upper ranks of the party,
in the upper ranks of the party,
such as the Chancellor Rishi Sunak and the Home Secretary Preeti Patel.
such as the Chancellor Rishi Sunak or the Home Secretary Preeti
It
Patel.
also hinted in 2019
It also hinted in 2019
that it could deliver 40 seats for the party.
that it could deliver 40 seats for the party.
There is much to fear in this.
There is much to fear in this.
One is the balkanization of foreign policy,
One is the balkanization of foreign policies,
designing policies to suit particular domestic interest groups.
designing policies to suit particular interest groups.
Another is raw emotion.
Another is raw emotion.
The problems of Israel and Kashmir are complicated enough
The problems of Israel and Kashmir are complicated enough
before they become intertwined with the local politics of North London or Bolton.
before they become intertwined with local politics of North London or Bolton.
A third is what Samuel Huntington called the clash of civilizations.
A third is what Samuel Huntington called the clash of civilizations.
The more Labour becomes identified with Muslims
The more Labour becomes identified with the Muslims
and the Conservatives with Hindu and Israeli nationalism,
and the Conservatives with the Hindu and Israeli nationalism,
the more wrenching conflicts will be reproduced in Britain's constituencies.
the more wrenching conflicts will be reproduced in Britain's constituencies.
How can policymakers avoid such disasters
How can policymakers avoid such disasters
while acknowledging that Britain has been transformed by mass immigration?
while acknowledging that Britain has been transformed by mass immigration?
It is easy to say that politicians must pursue the national interests rather than the sectional interests of ethnic groups.
It is easy to say that politicians must pursue national interests than sectional interests of ethnic minority groups.
But what is the national interest
But what is the national interest?
but the sum of the interests of all the country's citizens?
But the sum of the interests of all the country's citizens.
If the composition of those citizens changes,
If the composition of those citizens changes,
then so does that interest.
those interests.
Ethnic groups have a perfect right to organize and agitate.
Ethnic groups have a perfect organized and agitate.
And Britain's regional interest in India and Pakistan and Kashmir
And Britain's regional interests in Pakistan, India, and Israel
is surely shaped by the fact that millions of British citizens have strong family connections there.
Is surely shaped by the fact that millions of British have strong family connections there.
It is also easy enough to say that policymakers should avoid seeing policy.
It is also easy enough to say that policymakers seeing policies
through the eyes of particular groups.
through the eyes of particular groups.
But another danger comes from doing the opposite.
But another danger comes from doing the opposite.
Seeing all foreign policy as an extension of domestic struggles.
Seeing all foreign policies as an extension of domestic struggles.
Jeremy Corbyn, Labour's former leader who appeared on the national stage this week.
Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour's leader who appeared on the national stage this week.
Standing next to an inflatable figure with a hooked nose.
Standing next to an inflatable figure with a hooked nose.
Is a leading offender. He sees groups such as Palestinians and Kashmiris.
He sees groups such as Palestinians and Kashmiris
as the global equivalents of the British working classes.
As the global equivalents of Britain's working classes.
A homogeneous mass of the oppressed.
A homogeneous mass of the oppressed.
Rather than particular peoples operating in particular contexts.
Rather than particular peoples in particular contexts.
Some Brexiteers make the same mistake by positing a global struggle.
Some Brexiteers make the same mistake by positing global struggle.
Forces of rising nationalism on the one hand.
Between forces of rising nationalism on the one hand,
and a retreating globalism on the other.
And a retreating globalism on the other.
Foreign policymakers need to update their skills for a new age.
Foreign policymakers need to update their skills on... 잠시만. 문 닫고 왔습니다.
New age. Foreign policymakers need to update their skills for a new age.
Foreign policymakers need to update their skills for a new age.
For example, they need to be more sensitive to the importance of cultural ties.
For example, they need to be more sensitive to the importance of cultural ties.
And the power of religion.
As the part of a religion.
But they also need to make vigorous use of some of the oldest tools in the diplomatic box.
But they also need to diplomatic box.
Notably, objectivity and skepticism.
Notably, objectivity and skepticism.
They should pour cold water on ethnic passions.
They should pour cold water on ethnic passions.
Even while recognizing the power of those passions.
Even while recognizing the power of those.
They also need to cut self-proclaimed community leaders and friends organizations.
They also need to cut self-proclaiming ethnic representatives and local
down
leaders.
To size, for neither is truly representative.
Down to size, for neither is truly representative.
Most ethnic communities are divided about foreign policy.
Most ethnic groups are divided by foreign policy.
Many British Jews oppose Israel's policy in the West Bank.
Many Jews oppose to the...
In the West Bank. Many British Jews oppose Israel's policy in the West Bank.
Many British Jews oppose to Israel's policy in West Bank.
While many young Muslims ignore the elderly imams.
While many young Muslims ignore the opinion of elderly imams.
Who claim to speak on behalf of their faith.
who claim to speak on behalf of their faith.
Some friends organizations are controlled by factions
Some friends organizations are controlled by factions
with a very particular take on the domestic policies of the countries
to the very particular take of the domestic countries
they claim to represent. Others are little more than a handful of lobbyists and a letterhead.
Others are little more than a handful of lobbyists and letterheads.
There is also reason for cautious optimism.
There is also reason for cautious optimism.
The country's ethnic minorities ought to be important resources for global Britain.
The country's ethnic minorities ought to be important resources for global Britain
as it turns from Europe to Asia. Who better to forge closer trading ties
closer trading ties
than people who can speak the local language,
people who can speak their language,
and who have family ties with local trading groups,
and who have strong family ties with the trading locals.
Norman Tebbit, a Conservative cabinet minister in the 1980s.
Norman Tebbit,
a Conservative cabinet minister in the 1980s.
Norman Tebbit of the cabinet in the 1970s.
Coined his cricket test in the name of division. He wanted to see where people's loyalties lay.
We wanted to see where people's loyalties lay.
But cricket also provides an example of the opposite. A game that was invented by an imperial nation. Is played by Hindus, Muslims, and dozens of other ethnic and religious groups.
Is played by
Hindus, Muslims, and dozens of other ethnic and religious groups.
Is played by Hindus, Muslims, and dozens of other ethnic and religious groups.
Who put aside their differences. And observe a common set of rules.
끝났습니다.